Good morning. I want to begin by saying that moments like this, moments defined by geopolitical tension, military posturing, and the kind of alarming headlines that travel faster than verified facts, are precisely the moments when calm, structured, and evidence based analysis becomes not just valuable, but essential. It is in the nature of financial markets, of global trade systems, and of the international monetary architecture that uncertainty itself carries a cost. And today, the uncertainty surrounding the escalating tensions between the United States and Iran, compounded by the most recent and deeply concerning statements emerging from Moscow, has introduced a layer of systemic risk that no responsible economic policymaker can afford to ignore or minimize. Let me be clear from the outset. I am not here to traffic in fear. I am not here to amplify the anxieties that are already circulating across cable news networks, social media platforms, and trading floors from New York to Tokyo. What I am here to do, what I have always endeavored to do throughout my tenure at the Federal Reserve and at the Treasury Department, is to speak plainly, to speak accurately, and to speak with the full weight of the data and analytical frameworks that this office demands. The American people deserve nothing less. And frankly, neither does the global community, which looks to the United States not only for military and diplomatic leadership, but for economic stability and financial clarity in times of profound stress. So let us begin where all serious economic analysis must begin, with the facts as we currently understand them, and with a clear eyed assessment of what those facts mean for the United States economy, for global energy markets, for our financial system, and for the long term trajectory of international economic cooperation. Because what is unfolding between Washington and Tehran, and what Moscow's intervention into this equation now represents, is not simply a military or diplomatic crisis. It is, at its core, an economic event of potentially historic magnitude, and it must be analyzed as such. The relationship between the United States and Iran has been defined for decades by a complex and often volatile interplay of sanctions, oil politics, nuclear negotiations, and regional proxy conflicts. The economic dimensions of this relationship are inseparable from its geopolitical ones. Iran sits atop some of the largest proven oil and natural gas reserves in the world. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow maritime corridor through which approximately 20% of the world's traded oil passes every single day, runs along Iran's southern coastline. Any significant military escalation between American forces and Iranian military or proxy forces carries with it the immediate and credible threat of disruption to that choke point. And the disruption of that choke point, even temporarily, even partially, would send shockwaves through global energy markets that would be felt in every economy on Earth, from the largest industrialized nations to the most vulnerable developing economies that can least afford an oil price spike. I want to spend a moment on that number, 20%, because I think it is often cited without sufficient appreciation of what it actually means in practical terms. We are talking about roughly 17 to 21 million barrels of oil per day transiting through a waterway that, at its narrowest point, is only 21 miles wide. This includes not only crude oil, but also liquefied natural gas, petrochemical products, and refined fuels. The nations whose energy security depends most heavily on unimpeded Hormuz transit include not only the United States and its European allies, but Japan, South Korea, India, and China, virtually the entire architecture of the modern global economy. A sustained closure or even a significant degradation of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz would not produce a localized price shock. It would produce a synchronized global energy crisis of a kind we have not seen since the 1973 Arab oil embargo, and arguably far worse given how deeply integrated global supply chains have become in the intervening half-century. Now, into this already volatile and deeply concerning situation, we must now factor in the statements that have emerged from the Kremlin. President Putin's ultimatum, and I use that word deliberately because that is precisely what it is, represents a qualitative escalation in the strategic calculus surrounding this conflict. Russia's interests in the Middle East are layered and well documented. Moscow has cultivated deep military, economic, and political relationships with Tehran over the past 2 decades, relationships that have only deepened since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. Russian and Iranian interests have converged in Syria, in arms transfers, in drone technology sharing, and in a shared strategic objective of challenging American influence across the broader Middle East and Central Asian regions. When President Putin issues what international observers are characterizing as his most serious ultimatum to date, warning in terms that leave very little room for diplomatic interpretation, that Russian interests and Russian allies will be defended. The economic implications are immediate and severe. Let me explain why. Financial markets do not wait for wars to begin before pricing in the risk of wars. Markets are forward-looking instruments. They price probability, not certainty. And when a nuclear-armed power with the second largest conventional military force on the planet issues explicit ultimatums in the context of an already active and escalating military confrontation, the probability distribution of outcomes shifts in ways that rational market participants cannot and will not ignore. We saw this dynamic play out in a somewhat more contained form in the early days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Within 72 hours of the invasion beginning, global wheat prices surged by more than 50%. Natural gas prices in Europe reached levels that had never been recorded in the history of European energy markets. The S&P 500 entered correction territory. The dollar strengthened sharply as global investors fled to safety assets. These were not irrational panic responses. They were the predictable and in many ways entirely rational responses of a globally integrated financial system processing the sudden and dramatic repricing of geopolitical risk. What we are now contemplating, a direct or proximate military confrontation between the United States and Iran, potentially with Russian backing or intervention, is an event of substantially greater potential magnitude than the Ukraine conflict in terms of its global economic implications. I want to address directly and without equivocation the question that is on the minds of every market participant, every finance minister, and frankly, every ordinary American family trying to understand what this means for their mortgage, their grocery bill, their retirement savings, and their job security. That question is this: are we on the threshold of a global economic disruption severe enough to trigger recession, financial instability, or something worse? And my answer, the honest, data-informed, analytically rigorous answer, is that the risk is real, it is present, and it is rising. But it is not yet inevitable. And that distinction matters enormously because the space between rising risk and inevitable catastrophe is precisely where policy, diplomacy, and institutional resilience either prove their worth or fail the test of history. The United States economy, as of the most recent data available to this office, remains fundamentally sound in several key respects. Labor markets, while showing some signs of normalization from the exceptionally tight conditions of 2022 and 2023, continue to generate employment at a pace consistent with trend growth. Core inflation, while still modestly above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, has declined substantially from its peak and is moving in the right direction. The banking system, following the stress episodes of early 2023, has been subject to enhanced supervisory scrutiny and has demonstrated meaningful improvements in liquidity positioning. These are not trivial strengths. They are the foundations upon which economic resilience in a crisis is built. But foundations, however strong, are not immune to seismic events. And what we are now discussing, a potential military conflict in the Persian Gulf region, backed or complicated by Russian strategic intervention, occurring against a backdrop of already elevated global debt levels, already strained multilateral institutions, and already fragile post-pandemic supply chains, represents exactly the kind of seismic event that can overwhelm even well-prepared economic systems. The fiscal space available to advanced economies to respond to a major external shock is considerably narrower today than it was in 2008 or even in 2020. Interest rates, while beginning to normalize, remain elevated relative to the post-financial crisis decade. Government debt levels in virtually every major economy are at or near historic highs. The capacity for another round of the kind of aggressive fiscal and monetary stimulus that cushioned previous crises is genuinely constrained. This is the context, and the full, honest, unvarnished economic context within which we must evaluate Putin's ultimatum and the trajectory of US-Iran tensions. And it is a context that demands seriousness, demands discipline, and demands the kind of coordinated international economic response that has historically only been mobilized when leaders of vision and courage choose cooperation over confrontation. I will address what such a response must look like in the sections that follow, but I want to close this first section by saying something that I believe with every fiber of my professional and personal conviction. The economic costs of miscalculation here are not abstract. They are not confined to spreadsheets and policy papers. They will be borne by working families in Akron and Atlanta, by farmers in Iowa and Kansas, by small business owners in every congressional district in this country, and by billions of people around the world who have no seat at the table where these decisions are made, but who will live with their consequences for a generation or more. That is the weight of this moment, and that is why I am speaking today with the directness and the gravity that this moment demands. Having established the broad contours of the geopolitical and economic landscape in which this crisis is unfolding, I want to turn now to a more granular and technically precise examination of the specific economic transmission channels through which a US-Iran military escalation, particularly one complicated by Russian strategic involvement, would propagate through the global economy. Because it is not sufficient, in my judgment, to speak in generalities about economic risk. Policymakers, market participants, and informed citizens deserve a clear and detailed understanding of exactly how the shock travels, from the initial military event, through the energy system, through the financial system, through the trade system, and ultimately into the lived economic reality of households and businesses. This is the analytical work that distinguishes serious economic stewardship from mere crisis commentary, and it is the work I intend to do here. Let us begin with the most immediate and direct transmission channel, energy markets. I have already noted the strategic significance of the Strait of Hormuz, but I want to deepen that analysis considerably. The global oil market is, at its most fundamental level, a system engineered to operate with relatively modest spare capacity buffers. The OPEC Plus alliance, which includes both Saudi Arabia and Russia, has in recent years maintained a policy of managed production restraint designed to keep oil prices within a range that serves the fiscal needs of producer nations without triggering demand destruction in consumer economies. As of the most recent data, global spare production capacity, meaning the volume of oil that can be brought to market within 30 days and sustained for 90 days, stands at approximately 4 to 5 million barrels per day, the overwhelming majority of which is concentrated in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Now consider what happens when you introduce the prospect of Hormuz disruption into this equation. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are themselves Hormuz-dependent exporters. Their primary export terminals, Ras Tanura, Juaima, Jebel Dana, all funnel oil through or near the strait. While Saudi Arabia does maintain the East-West pipeline, which can carry approximately 5 million barrels per day to Red Sea terminals at Yanbu, that infrastructure has not operated at full capacity for years and would require significant time to optimize under emergency conditions. The UAE has the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, with a capacity of approximately 1.5 million barrels per day, providing some bypass capability. But these alternative routes together cannot come close to replacing the full volume of Hormuz transits if the strait is significantly disrupted. The arithmetic simply does not work in the world's favor. The price implications of a serious Hormuz disruption are, by any honest modeling exercise, severe. Academic and institutional research, including work published by the International Energy Agency, the International Monetary Fund, and various Federal Reserve branches, consistently suggests that a complete closure of the Strait of Hormuz for a period of 1 month or more could produce an oil price spike of between 50 and 200% above pre-crisis levels, depending on the duration of the disruption and the effectiveness of strategic reserve releases. The United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve currently holds approximately 350 to 370 million barrels, a meaningful buffer, but one that represents less than 20 days of total U.S. petroleum consumption and far less than 20 days of global consumption. Coordinated releases from International Energy Agency member countries could extend that runway somewhat, but the fundamental supply-demand mathematics in a sustained Hormuz closure scenario remain deeply unfavorable. What does a 100% oil price increase mean in practical economic terms for the United States? The research literature on oil price shocks and macroeconomic outcomes is extensive and reasonably consistent in its findings. A sustained doubling of oil prices, all else equal, would add approximately 2 to 3 percentage points to headline consumer price inflation within 6 to 12 months. It would reduce real GDP growth by approximately 1 to 2 percentage points over the same horizon. It would disproportionately burden lower-income households who spend a larger share of their income on energy and transportation costs and have fewer financial buffers to absorb price increases. It would compress corporate profit margins across transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and chemicals, sectors that together account for a substantial share of both employment and capital investment in the American economy. And it would confront the Federal Reserve with precisely the most difficult policy dilemma in the central banker's handbook: simultaneously rising inflation and slowing growth, the condition known as stagflation, which the tools of monetary policy are structurally ill-equipped to address. I want to dwell on the stagflation risk for a moment because I think it is insufficiently appreciated in much of the current public commentary on this crisis. The Federal Reserve's dual mandate, maximum employment and price stability, is relatively straightforward to pursue when the two objectives are aligned, as they were during most of the post-2008 recovery period when both inflation and unemployment were elevated and the prescription was clear: keep monetary policy accommodative. It becomes considerably more complex when the two objectives are in tension, as they were during 2022 and 2023, when the Fed was compelled to raise interest rates aggressively to combat inflation, even at the cost of some labor market cooling. But the most difficult version of the problem, the version that broke the policy frameworks of the 1970s and required the painful Volcker-era recessions to resolve, is the version where inflation is being driven not by excess domestic demand, but by an external supply shock, while simultaneously the economy is weakening due to the real income destruction that high energy prices produce. In that environment, raising interest rates to combat inflation risks accelerating the economic slowdown. But holding rates steady or cutting them risks allowing inflation expectations to become unanchored, which carries its own severe long-term costs. There is no clean solution to this dilemma. There is only the least bad option, chosen under conditions of uncertainty, with incomplete information, under enormous political and public pressure. I lived through a version of this dilemma during my time at the Federal Reserve. I can tell you with complete honesty that it is among the most consequential and most uncomfortable positions that a monetary policymaker can occupy. And a serious US-Iran conflict, particularly one that produces a sustained energy price shock, would place the Federal Reserve's next leadership directly into that position. Beyond energy markets, the second major transmission channel I want to examine is financial market contagion. Modern financial markets are characterized by deep interconnection, high-frequency information processing, and the kind of reflexive dynamics that can transform a regional geopolitical event into a global financial stability concern within hours. We have seen this pattern repeatedly: the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the 2008 Lehman collapse, the 2020 COVID shock. In each case, the initial trigger event was geographically or sectorally specific, but the transmission through financial markets was rapid, global, and in each case substantially more severe than pre-crisis models had projected. The specific financial stability concerns in a US Iran escalation scenario are multiple and layered. First, there is the direct exposure of financial institutions to energy sector counterparties, oil producers, refiners, shipping companies, commodity traders, whose creditworthiness and liquidity positions would be severely stressed by both the price volatility and the operational disruptions of a Hormuz crisis. Second, there is the broader risk off dynamic that major geopolitical shocks invariably produce, in which investors simultaneously reduce exposure to equities, credit, and emerging market assets, driving sharp increases in risk premiums across virtually all asset classes. Third, and perhaps most concerning from a systemic stability perspective, there is the potential for margin calls and forced deleveraging in leveraged financial positions to create self-reinforcing downward spirals in asset prices, the kind of liquidity crisis dynamic that transforms a manageable correction into a genuine financial crisis. The specific vulnerability I want to highlight here is the derivatives market exposure to oil price volatility. Global energy derivatives markets, futures, options, swaps, have notional values that dwarf the underlying physical markets by orders of magnitude. Many of the participants in these markets, hedge funds, commodity trading advisors, structured product vehicles, operate with significant leverage. A rapid and violent oil price spike of the kind that a Hormuz disruption would produce could trigger margin calls of extraordinary scale across these markets simultaneously. The ability of clearing houses and prime brokers to manage this margin call cascade without creating broader financial system stress is not something I would want to take for granted. The 2022 episode in European natural gas markets, where price spikes generated margin calls that threatened the solvency of multiple major energy utilities and required emergency government interventions across several European countries, is a recent and instructive precedent. The third transmission channel I want to address is trade and supply chain disruption. The Persian Gulf region is not only a critical energy transit corridor, it is also a major node in global shipping lanes that carry manufactured goods, agricultural commodities, raw materials, and consumer products between Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Any significant military activity in the Gulf region would produce immediate and severe disruptions to commercial shipping, as insurance underwriters withdraw coverage, shipping companies reroute vessels, and port operations in the region are curtailed or suspended. The container shipping disruptions produced by the Red Sea Houthi attacks in late 2023 and 2024, which were, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively contained and lower intensity disruption, produced measurable increases in global shipping costs, extended delivery times across multiple manufacturing supply chains, and contributed to a modest but real uptick in goods price inflation in several major economies. A full-scale US-Iran military conflict would produce disruptions of incomparably greater severity and duration. American agricultural exporters, wheat, corn, soybeans, cotton, depend heavily on Gulf and Red Sea shipping routes to reach their largest markets in Asia and the Middle East. American manufactured goods exporters, including aerospace, defense, and industrial equipment manufacturers, similarly depend on these routes. The disruption costs would not be symmetric. They would fall disproportionately on export-dependent sectors and on the workers and communities that depend on those sectors for their livelihoods. The farm communities of the Midwest and Great Plains, already under significant financial pressure from the combination of high input costs, normalized commodity prices, and rising debt service burdens, would face additional and potentially severe market access disruptions at precisely the moment when their financial resilience is most strained. I want to close this section by bringing these transmission channels together into a composite picture of what the macroeconomic impact of a serious US-Iran conflict, one complicated by Russian involvement, might look like for the United States and for the global economy. The honest answer is that the range of outcomes is extraordinarily wide, and any economist who presents you with a precise point forecast for this scenario is either overconfident or not being fully candid about the genuine uncertainty involved. What I can say with confidence is that the downside scenarios, the scenarios in which energy markets are severely disrupted, financial contagion spreads, supply chains fracture, and the global economy enters a synchronized recession are not tail risks in the statistical sense of being extremely unlikely. They are plausible central scenarios given the severity of the trigger event under discussion. And the economic and human costs of those scenarios, measured in lost jobs, reduced living standards, increased poverty, and diminished long term growth potential, would be staggering in their scale and deeply inequitable in their distribution. This is not alarmism. This is arithmetic. And it is arithmetic that demands to be taken with the utmost seriousness by every person in a position of economic or political responsibility.